Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our History Happy Hour here for August the 15th, 2024. This is our last in the series for this year, but we're looking forward to keeping this tradition going. And here, last but not least, and certainly an excellent speaker, author, radio host, and historian is Dr. Timothy Holder. Dr. Holder has written a series of books, and he'd like to tell us a little bit about it in our History Happy Hour series.
All right. So I'm glad to be here again. I was here last year and talked about how early presidents handled adversity and what we can learn from them. And so I'm going to give you more of the same this year. I'm going to tell you 6 more stories. I'm going to start with Andrew Johnson, who was really a great politician until one day he wasn't. And that was spectacular. And then I'm going to tell you about James Monroe, who had a challenge that some of us have faced, and probably most of us will face at some point in our lives. He had to figure out how to follow greatness. George Washington had some self-esteem issues in 1755, and I'll talk about those. And then I'll tell you a Teddy Roosevelt story that is thoroughly Teddy Roosevelt. After that, I'll talk about John Adams and his pride issue. And then the adversity that I will talk about does not belong to a man, it belongs to a city. And that's the story that I will end with. So first, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, pretty well known around here because he was from around here. I'll stay on camera. Okay, so Andrew Johnson grew up incredibly poor, as many, if not all of you know. A lot of historians say that he might have been from the poorest family in American history to ever produce a president. I think the James Garfield family might give them a run for their money, but both families were incredibly poor. And so what that did for Andrew Johnson was it gave him a way to relate to working class, white, poor voters. And it made him a very effective politician. He knew how to speak to that demographic. And so he was able to begin to get elected to offices locally in Greenville, Tennessee, and then he got elected at the state level. And then, of course, he starts going and representing the people of Tennessee on the national level. And as most, if not all of you would remember, when the southern states began to secede right before the Civil War, Andrew Johnson was the only politician from a Confederate state who didn't give up his seat. And so his loyalty to the Union was noticed by Northern Republicans, even though he was a Southern Democrat. And when Abraham Lincoln was up for re-election, Northern Republican leadership decided, you know, we could use this Andrew Johnson guy. We could put him on the ticket with Lincoln, and it would really promote an attitude of a symbol of unity for the country. You know, it's not about North and South, it's not about Republican and Democrat, we're all Americans. That would be the message that it would send if they had Andrew Johnson run as the vice president for Abraham Lincoln. And it would be crazy in today's world to think of our political parties splitting the ticket like that. I mean, can you imagine if Donald Trump got reelected in November and chose a Democrat to be his VP? Or if Kamala Harris picked a Republican to run alongside her? That would just really be strange today. But the Republican leadership thought it would be okay in 1864 because constitutionally, the vice president only has 2 responsibilities. Take over for the president if the president dies, and of course they had no way of knowing that Lincoln was going to be assassinated. They felt like he's a reasonably healthy guy, surely he will survive the next 4 years. So they didn't figure that Andrew Johnson would be in a position to mess anything up. He'd be pretty harmless. And the only other thing the vice president has to do, according to the Constitution, is break tie votes in the Senate. But with the Northern Republican leadership so firmly entrenched in the Senate, they figured we've got such a majority that Andrew Johnson won't need to break any ties. And so they really thought this is a nice, safe, easy pick, but it will create this symbol, this image of unity. So of course Lincoln wins re-election in 1864, and Inauguration Day rolls around, and it turns out Andrew Johnson is dreadfully sick. He's feverish, he's not quite in his right mind, he really feels terrible. And so when they go to him and say, okay, it's Inauguration Day, it's a full day of meetings and parties, and you got to give a big speech, Andrew Johnson said, I really don't feel good at all. Give me a couple of days, give me a week or so, and I'll be fine, and I'll do whatever you want me to do then. And they said, we don't need you in a few days. We don't need you in a week or so. We don't need you for the next 4 years, but we need you today. So get out of bed and get to it. And somebody thought, we'll help the guy brace himself. We'll give him a little alcohol that'll kind of toughen his spine a little bit, and it'll help him get through the day. It actually made things worse. And so there Andrew Johnson is, stumbling through his day, feverish, not quite in his right mind, and he finally gets to the point where he's got to give just this one big speech. And not in full possession of his faculties, he decided to talk about how what was really wrong with America, it wasn't the Confederacy, it was all the rich and powerful people in the country who didn't care about the little guy. So basically the stump speech that had probably gotten him elected over and over again. But the problem was, on that day, he was speaking to a whole bunch of the rich and powerful in Washington, D.C., and there he is telling them, "You're what's wrong with America." And he's slurring his way through the speech, sounding like he's drunk, and it really left a bad impression with these people. And it wasn't that long after this, of course, that Lincoln's assassinated. And now this Southern Democrat who has alienated a whole bunch of Republicans, now he's the president. And so it's not shocking that a little bit down the road, they end up impeaching him and trying to throw him out of office. And so the lesson in adversity is perhaps summed up by that great American philosopher, Clint Eastwood, who once said in a movie, "A man's got to know his limitations." And so it is for us when it comes to adversity. Sometimes we reach a point and we need to be able to say no. And if we're not strong enough to say no in that moment, then a situation can go from bad to worse. So, next guy I want to talk about, as I told you, is James Monroe. James Monroe was the 5th president of the United States, and his problem was he followed 4 legitimately great men. George Washington was on such a pedestal that at one point in American history, we had 4 federal holidays: Christmas, Easter, Independence Day, and George Washington's birthday. That's how special George Washington was. During the Revolutionary War, there was this doctor who heard about an assassination plot against Washington, and he wrote in his diary he couldn't believe the British would want to commit sacricide, the murder of the sacred. That wasn't even a word back then. The guy invented it for his diary. But that, considering George Washington not like another human being but sacred, that tells you the pedestal that a lot of people had Washington on. So he's the first president, of course. John Adams is the second president, and I'm going to come back to him. Thomas Jefferson, third president, famous and beloved for the Declaration of Independence. He was also very widely admired for the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the country and removed the French as a potential threat to American expansion. And Jefferson was able to achieve all of that without firing a shot. And he lowered taxes. What's not to love? So a lot of people really loved Jefferson, and when he was just about done being president, he said, "Hey, all of you people, you should vote for James Madison. He's the greatest man in America." And coming from Jefferson, that really meant a lot to people. So I skipped over John Adams, but only because I wanted to build the case for who the other guys were before saying that John Adams was a better public speaker than any of them. So he could really stir a crowd. And legitimately, he's a patriot, he's a founding father, so he's beloved for all of that. He was known as the Atlas of the American Revolution, and I'll go into more detail on that later on. But you've got these 4 guys who are so widely admired, and then you've got James Monroe. So what do? So James Monroe shows up at his inauguration wearing the tri-cornered hat and the knickers, the pants that cut off at the knee, and it was a very fashionable look 40 years earlier. I mean, it would be as if I walked in tonight and said, "Hey, I'm going to talk to you about presidents," but imagine if I was dressed up like I just walked off the set of Miami Vice, the show from the 80s, and I was wearing a white suit and a pink shirt with no collar, and was like, "Hey, pal," and I would just really seem out of step. And that was James Monroe at his inauguration. He was looking really old-fashioned. And one of the first things he does as president is he takes this long, slow tour of all of the states individually. Nowadays, it's not as big of a deal when a president travels because the president has instant communication and transportation is really fast. Monroe didn't have either of those things, so it was quite a story that he wanted to visit every state. And he did it to promote unity. But he also did it because George Washington did it, and Monroe really admired Washington. And so Monroe has a lot of respect for old-fashioned things and tradition. But he also gave us the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said, it dealt with Latin America. And Latin America had recently gained its independence from the European powers. And the Monroe Doctrine said if any of those European countries tried to come back over to South America or Central America and reconquer those lands, the Monroe Doctrine said we would fight them. Now this was a bold, new thing in American foreign policy because the first 4 presidents had made clear we would be strictly neutral in foreign affairs. We didn't care about anybody else's business. We were just caring about what was going on with us. And so with James Monroe, you've got a guy who's got a whole lot of respect for tradition and old-fashioned things, but he was also willing to change when necessary. And so he was well equipped to handle adversity because he could lean in either direction. Most of us are much more comfortable in one camp or the other. Most of us either always want to keep things just the way they were, or we just want to come in and put our stamp on everything, and we don't really always have respect for things that have lasted for a reason. It is a rare quality in a leader to be able to lean in either direction as you need. And we have all seen politicians, coaches on sports teams, and businesses who either have been too hasty to change or too tradition-bound, like Blockbuster. For a while, they had a very effective business model. They even made fun of Netflix when Netflix offered something different. And where's Blockbuster today? They did not change as the market changed. So to be able to keep a foot in both worlds, to hold on to tradition when it works, but to be willing to make a bold change when necessary, that's tough. But that's what James Monroe brought to the table. Next guy I want to talk about is George Washington and why he had self-esteem issues in 1755. Going back years before this, young George Washington had a blueprint for how his life was supposed to turn out, or a roadmap. Washington's dad had several kids. His wife died. He married another woman. She had more kids, including George Washington. So George Washington had several siblings who were many years older than him. And he saw that his dad, who was reasonably prosperous, was able to afford to send them over to England for a top-class university education. And then they came back to Virginia, and the dad was able to give them some land and money and get them started. So Washington saw that that's how his life would unfold. But then when he was just 11 years old, his dad died. And the inheritance that Washington might have had a bigger piece of was now split in several directions. Some of it went to Washington's mother, but a lot of it went to these older half-siblings. And now Washington has more responsibilities at home, and his family doesn't have the resources that they had, and so he loses out on this really top-notch, world-class education, and he's got to scramble to figure out what is he going to do in life. And so a few years down the road, Washington has a plan. One of his older siblings had gone into the Royal Navy and had an impressive career and achieved quite a bit and got the rewards from that. And so Washington thought, I could do that. I could join the Royal Navy. And he was so committed to that that he actually packed his bags and headed to the coast. And then somebody said to Washington's mother, if he joins the Royal Navy, they will treat him worse than a dog. And so she sent someone to go and get him. And that person caught up with him and said, your mother has a message for you. You are not going to join the Navy today, young man. You get yourself home. And so, like a lot of frustrated teenagers who feels like mom just doesn't understand, Washington's pretty mad about this, but he honors his mother's wishes and goes back home. But now he still has to figure out what he's going to do with his life. And so he decides he's going to join the Royal Army. By the time he decides to do that, Washington is actually pretty well connected in the Virginia colony. He knows some influential families, and they write letters on his behalf. And isn't it crazy to think about how American history would be different if George Washington had actually joined the Redcoats many years before the Revolution? It's crazy to think about. But for whatever reason, the British Army was not interested in what George Washington had to offer. And the commission as an officer that he was looking for with them, it never came about. Not even when the British General Braddock showed up in the Virginia colony with a whole bunch of troops in an effort to root out the French and the Native Americans who were in the West and encroaching on land that Virginia had claimed. Washington appealed to Braddock and said, hey, I would really love to be an officer under your command. And Braddock said no. And Washington said, I've got experience in the Virginia militia, and I've gone out west, and you're looking for the French and the Indians? Well, I have negotiated with them. I have fought with them. I know where they are and how they think and how to get there. Sign me up. And Braddock still said no. He said, I will bring you along as a Virginia militia aide and guide, but I'm not giving you a commission in the British Army. And so they go marching out, and Washington, it's July of 1775, and he's looking at his life and thinking, things never work out for me. Lost my dad, I lost out on a chance at military glory in the Navy, and now the Army doesn't want me, and my teeth hurt, and my life is just so hard. Every time I try to do something, the door gets slammed shut and stays locked, and it's just not fair. And so they're marching through the wilderness, and they encounter the French and the Native Americans. Braddock gets killed, his officers get killed and wounded, and they're trying to organize a retreat so they don't all get slaughtered. And here is Washington, colonial guide, trying to provide some leadership and get them out of there. And in the process of all of this happening, Washington is on horseback, and the horse that he is on gets shot and goes down. And so he jumps on a second horse, and that horse gets shot also. And so he's finally able to get a horse that doesn't die on him, and he leads the troops out of there. And that night, when he takes his jacket off, he finds 4 bullet holes in his jacket. And he writes a letter to his brother, and one of his brothers, and says, my only explanation for why I would come so close to death so many times is that God has spared me for some noble purpose. And so Washington went from thinking, I'm a loser and nothing works out for me, to thinking, I'm special, and there's this mission that only I can serve. And so it's a good thing to remember when we experience adversity, because sometimes life beats us up, and it's easy to look around and think other people have things better and feel like we don't measure up. But like George Washington, in all the universe, there's only one of you. You're special in the eyes of God. You're like a fingerprint, or like a snowflake, or a tattoo that you might get in prison. There's none other that's exactly like you. You're special. Okay, so next guy I want to talk about, Theodore Roosevelt. There's a complaint that I've heard people make when it comes to the United States going to war. And they say, you know, it's the old politicians who decide to go to war, and it's the young people who go and fight and die. And if those politicians want that war so bad, maybe they should sign up for it. Maybe they should go and fight. But the politicians would typically say, well, you know, the job that I'm doing where I'm at is so important that I could do more good there than I could do as just one more officer in the military. But if anybody could legitimately make that complaint or that argument, it might have been Theodore Roosevelt in 1898 during the Spanish-American War, when he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under a guy who didn't really care that much about the job. The Secretary of the Navy, he liked the title, he liked the prestige, he liked going to important meetings with important people, he liked going to fancy parties, but as far as managing affairs in the Navy, he wasn't really that type A about it. He would usually even cut out a little early on Friday and get started on his weekend. Theodore Roosevelt, as his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, couldn't wait for the boss to leave, because that meant Roosevelt was in charge. And Roosevelt would stay late on Fridays and sometimes come in on Saturdays because he had a vision for what the Navy could be. Roosevelt saw that the British Empire was seen as the most powerful country in the world at the end of the 1800s. Britain, this tiny island nation, what made them so tough? They had the #1 Navy in the world. And Roosevelt figured, you know, with all the resources the United States has, and bordering 2 oceans like this, man, we're really well positioned to build up our Navy and become a legitimate world power. And so when the boss would leave, Roosevelt would really get active, sending out telegrams and memos and messages to admirals and captains and moving ships around and wanting more training for them and calling for more funding and more sailors. And he was really making a difference. And then the boss would wander in on Monday morning, slowly realize all the stuff that Roosevelt had been up to, and then ask himself, do I really want to go through all the work of undoing all this? Nah, it's fine, I guess. And he would just go on to the next thing, and Roosevelt would continue to make a difference. And so then the war starts, and if you're Theodore Roosevelt, you could certainly look at what you were doing and think, man, I'm contributing way more to the war effort, directing the Navy. I'm doing way more than I could do as just another officer. But Roosevelt wasn't driven by that. Roosevelt's dad was a great man who Roosevelt really admired. But Roosevelt's dad had one big regret. He was around during the Civil War, and he was a hardcore supporter for the Union living in New York. And so when the war started, he just took it for granted. I'm going to do my duty for my country. I'm going to join the war effort and fight for the Union. But Mr. Roosevelt had married a Southern belle, and she said to her husband, my brothers have joined the Confederate Army, and I just hate the idea of you seeing them in combat and you and them shooting at each other. I can't stand the thought. Please don't enlist. And so he didn't. He honored his wife, but he had that regret for the rest of his life that in his country's hour of need, he didn't respond. And so Theodore Roosevelt did not want to live with the same regret that his dad had. So he resigned his office and joined the army. And you know, a lot of politicians might think, hey, if I join the army during the war, that's really going to look good on my resume when I run for office in the future. And so they want to be in the military, but they don't necessarily want to see enemy fire. But Roosevelt used his connections to get himself moved to the front lines and faced enemy fire and won a medal for bravery in combat. He was legitimately a war hero. And the lesson in adversity that we get from Theodore Roosevelt is lead by example. I mean, you know, he believed in the war effort, and he was willing to go and fight. He was willing to go do the hard, dangerous work himself. All right, so John Adams was a great man by just about any metric you would want to use. I mentioned earlier he was called the Atlas of the American Revolution, like he was holding it all on his shoulders, which was a nice title for a guy who didn't fight. But Adams was one of the first to recognize we need to declare independence. When we started fighting the British at Lexington and Concord, it was April of 1775. Congress doesn't declare independence until July of 1776. More than a year went by, and the Army didn't know exactly what they were fighting for. Are we fighting to get Britain's attention? Are we fighting to get them to change policy? Or are we fighting for our freedom? It was a little bit ambiguous for more than a year. But Adams, from very early on, was saying, no, this needs to be a revolution. We need our independence. We need to be our own country. And he served on 26 different committees in the Continental Congress. That's crazy. And part of that time, he crossed the ocean and was negotiating in France to try to get aid for the Americans. And it's a dangerous voyage just because it's a dangerous voyage back then to cross the ocean, but also given what was going on with the British and the power of their navy. And the reason their navy was so powerful, one of the reasons, was they had more ships than anyone else. So, you know, it's a pretty long voyage across the ocean, and Adams went and came back and could have been captured by the British. So he did a lot during the war. He was legitimately a patriot. Obviously, he thought of as a founding father, vice president, president, lived long enough to see his son become president. And Adams is responsible for something else that doesn't get recognized as much. When the Americans declared their independence, every colony now became its own independent state, and they had to come up with a state government. So Massachusetts, where Adams was from, like all the other states, they had to come up with a state constitution. So Adams was selected during the war to be one of these delegates and be part of those conversations to put together the state constitution. And so after the delegates talked for a while, they said, okay, we're going to create a committee of 3 men, and they're going to put all this in writing, put their own ideas on it, and then we'll vote on the document that they create, and that will become our state constitution. And so Adams is one of these 3 men. The other 2 guys decide that John Adams should do the writing, which kind of reminds me of being in high school and you're stuck in a group project and you're in class and there's 5 of you, but only one of you has to write it all out and nobody wants to be that one, but somebody gets stuck with it. So there's John Adams. But Adams decides, okay, if I'm writing this Constitution, and there are people making arguments for and against all the issues, but Adams decides, I'm going to write into the Constitution, slavery is illegal. And then it'll just become a state law, and there won't be any hemming and hawing about when will we do it, how will we do it. We'll just say, it's against the law, no more slaves. And it was easier for Massachusetts to do that without turning their state upside down because they had a pretty small slave population. They had the smallest population of slaves per capita of any of the original 13 states. But still, he did it. And his committee went along with it, and a majority of the delegates went along with it. And slavery was ended in Massachusetts, and John Adams was a driving force in that. Now, Maine was not a state back then, but the territory that became the state of Maine was a part of the state of Massachusetts. So John Adams, you could argue, almost single-handedly ended slavery in 2 of our 50 states. That's pretty cool. But for all of the stuff that John Adams accomplished, it was never really enough because he was always frustrated that other men had more popularity. Adams, when he was in France trying to negotiate the French getting involved in helping out in the American Revolution, Adams was up at the crack of dawn. He was reading all the reports and letters that would come in. He was writing all the reports and letters he was supposed to write. He was going to all the meetings. He was crossing all the T's, dotting all the I's. Ben Franklin was staying out late at night, going to parties, sleeping till noon, showing up occasionally, but the French just loved him. And Adams was so frustrated by that he was the guy working really hard, but Ben Franklin was the one getting all the love because of his charisma. Adams, he liked George Washington. They were friends, but he was frustrated at Washington's popularity. When Abigail Adams met George Washington for the first time, she wrote her husband a letter and said basically, okay, you told me he was amazing, but you didn't tell me the half of it. Which is really not the letter that a husband wants to read from his wife. That's pretty tough. And I don't remember exactly when that happened, but man, if Washington was president then and Adams was the VP, and it's like, she's going on like this about the guy who's my boss. Wow, kill me now. So that's pretty tough for Adams. He didn't like that. And he also was very good friends, and then not, and then friends again, famously with Thomas Jefferson. But with Jefferson, everything Adams did, Jefferson did it better. Adams was on the committee to write the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson gets credit for being the one to actually pen the thing. John Adams gets elected vice president. So did Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson was also Secretary of State before that, so that's more impressive. John Adams was elected President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was elected twice. And so everything Adams does, Jefferson outshines him. And you might remember, because this is a room full of people who like history, that John Adams' last words were Jefferson still lives. And usually historians will say Adams was trying to be reassuring to the people in the room because here he was, this titan of the American Revolution, and he was going, but he was saying everything's fine, Jefferson is still with you. But there's one historian who suggested that maybe Adams is thinking on his deathbed, I've lived a really long life, but Jefferson has beaten me again. I'm dying, but Jefferson still lives. And then he was no more. So, what was Adams really thinking? I don't know. But the lesson in adversity is, actually, it's a quotation from Theodore Roosevelt. Comparison is the thief of joy. Adams wasn't content with all the great things that he did. He was jealous that these other people did a little bit more. And so the lesson in adversity there is we really need to not compare ourselves to other people. Because, we can be frustrated about our circumstances and say, well, they don't have it so bad. Why is their life so easy? It doesn't make our circumstances better. So, comparison is a thief of joy. Don't compare yourself to others. Okay, the last story that I want to tell you, I said, is about a place. New York City. Late 1800s, they've got a problem. 1890s. Criminals are getting more brazen and violent. There's corruption in the police force. And so the political leaders in New York City decide, you know what we need? We need a guy with impeccable integrity who will come in and clean things up. And so Theodore Roosevelt in 1895 was selected to be the police commissioner in New York City, or Gotham, as it's sometimes called. Theodore Roosevelt had a world-class mind, and he figured, hey, I don't have superpowers, but I'm smart, and I can use science and technology to fight crime. And so one of the things he used was this new invention known as a camera. So like if somebody was a victim of a crime, they had pictures of known criminals and people who've gone to jail and were out again. And so you could look at mugshots, basically. That was new technology back then. So that was something that Theodore Roosevelt really pushed. Roosevelt also figured, other than this new technology that he brought to the table, that when the police were like investigating some kind of group of criminals and they were ready to go in and make arrests, Roosevelt said, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to go with you, cops. Even though as police commissioner, I'm not technically a part of the police, but I'm police adjacent and I'm fighting crime. I'm going to go with you, and we're going to get them at night. And his rationale was that law-abiding citizens would probably be home safely in their beds. And so if things got violent, you wouldn't have law-abiding New Yorkers caught in the crossfire. So here's Roosevelt wanting to fight crime at night. And because he was a rich guy and people dressed a little more formally back then, and Roosevelt had a sense of the dramatic, sometimes when he would dress up in his nice suit, he'd throw a cape on. And so if you're thinking, that sounds a little bit like Batman, it's not a coincidence. When Batman was created, part of the inspiration for his character was Theodore Roosevelt. And I just think that's cool. And it reminds me of a meme that I saw years ago, and it was advice for expectant mothers. And the advice was, ladies, name your baby Gotham. It doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl. That way, when the baby's crying at 2 in the morning, all you need to do is lean over and whisper in your husband's ear, you've got to get up, honey. Gotham needs you. And your husband will get up every time. And so there you go. Does it help you with adversity? I don't know, but I think everybody needs a little more Batman. So, all right. So Andrew Johnson, the lesson in adversity, know your limitations. From James Monroe, be comfortable with tradition and with bold change, depending on the circumstances. With George Washington, remember, you are special in the eyes of God. In all the universe, you are unique. From Theodore Roosevelt, lead by example. John Adams, don't be prideful. Comparison is the thief of joy. And try to get a little more Batman in your life. Okay, so I'm going to offer 2 commercials for my own behalf, and then invite like 2 minutes worth of questions, or if you don't have a random question about a president, I'll throw some trivia at you. But just like last year, I have a few books here. They're $15 a piece, or 2 for $25. My newest book just came out about a month and a half ago. It's called Fortune, Fire, and Hope, and it's a look at the religious views of 5 early presidents. I also have a book that's kind of based on the talks that I do on adversity. It's called Feeling the Squeeze, and it's how we handle adversity, positive things we can do, negative things we sometimes do, and it's got a whole bunch of historical examples to make the medicine go down. I've got a presidential trivia book that was aimed at kids. It's got stories and trivia and games, and I had somebody tell me, hey, the games, they're kind of good mental exercises. It's like Sudoku without the math. So she was trying to sell me on the idea that the trivia book really works for all ages. And then my wife and I wrote a devotional together. So those are the 4 books that I have. The other commercial would be, if you know of another group where you think, hey, this talk on how to handle adversity and stories about presidents, this might work for this group. Or if you know a group that's interested in a talk on the faith of George Washington, that's another one that I do. So anybody have a random question about a president? that you've been thinking, you know, I've had this question about Rutherford Hayes, and I haven't had an opportunity to ask anybody. Here we are. Yes, sir.
I've always wondered why Johnson never had his wife come to Washington, D.C.
Did she have health issues, or was she
Well, I
shy?
thought she had some health issues. But
Yeah, it
but
might have been
then
that.
wasn't it, can't remember who, was it his sister or somebody that really acted as
Yeah.
a hostess?
Yeah, a lot of these guys will have somebody step in, and I remember like Thomas Jefferson, occasionally Dolly Madison would serve as his hostess. And I always thought, because she did that for him and then obviously for her own husband, I always thought there's a joke there. Dolly Madison, hostess, the two snack cake friends. I can't come up with a joke, but it's like there's all the pieces, and I got nothing. All right. Anything else there about President? Yes, sir.
Abigail Adams, I think she had a large influence on her husband.
Yeah, and it was really a beneficial one because Adams, you know, everything was new with George Washington as the first president. Nobody had done that before. And so there was no one really to establish precedents, no pun intended, for like how you act. Even as a head of state, how do you greet people? Because a normal person shakes hands, but a king doesn't shake hands. But Washington isn't a king, but he's a head of state, so what does he do? And so when John Adams, and so the point is, well, in case you're wondering, George Washington bowed. And so Thomas Jefferson is the first handshaking president. But with John Adams, the new thing that he's got to deal with is, okay, it's the end of Washington's second term. He's going home. I've got his cabinet. A president nowadays, the cabinet would all resign, and the new president would have his own people. But Adams made the mistake of asking these guys, hey, you want to keep doing what you're doing, or do you guys want to go home? And they all said, we're going to hold on to our jobs. So Adams couldn't pick people who were loyal to him. And so his entire cabinet was more loyal to Alexander Hamilton. And so that created problems. And you would think, well, they both belong to the same political party. But as you know, sometimes you get some tensions in between a political party. So fortunately for John Adams, Abigail was the most brilliant of the wives of the founding fathers. So she really had a lot of insight, and it was a blessing for him that he could rely on her since he really couldn't trust the people in his own cabinet. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen.